Good morning, good evening. Welcome to week 5 of MPAI 600 here at Georgetown University's Applied Intelligence program. Halfway through the course, so I hope everything's going well with you. And if there's any issues, as always, please let me know. So, announcements, October 5th, Thursday, I'm going to have at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, Zoom conference. So what I want to do for that is to open it up for questions on the paper. You should be, and I'll talk about the paper in a second, but what I want you to do is start with the paper, and as you go through your paper, you're going through the research, which there's probably not a whole lot of research, but as you're thinking through questions, bring those questions to me. So it's not going to be something I lecture. It's something I want you to bring your questions to me. And I guarantee you, if you have a question about the paper or there's something unclear, 5 other people do. So I want to make that clear from the onset. So again, it's not mandatory, but it is encouraged so you can get the ball rolling on your paper and answer any questions. And I can't reiterate enough. Start your paper soon, like now when you're writing this or when you're listening to this. Start outlining it, thinking what you're going to say, what cases you're going to emphasize, so you can bring up questions on that 5 October Zoom conference session. And I'll send out a link this week. Paper 2 is due 8 October, speaking of which. Again, 8 October, 11:59 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I'm not going to be too generous with extensions unless there's a medical or a major family issue. So, current events, I've been watching this, and I'm a history buff. Ken Burns, the documentarian, has a great documentary on the Vietnam War. Fantastic. Just saw the last episode last night, and I usually don't. I've read enough or seen enough history that I'm usually not thinking about like the emotional side of history, but he definitely hit it hard on that last episode this past week. And the reason I bring it up is, again, the patterns of history always repeat themselves. And for those of you who suffered through the Iraq War or even just followed it in the news, Iraq and Afghanistan, you'll see the same things happened in Vietnam, and this just kind of illustrates what happened. So, the cliche is if you don't learn from history, you're doomed to repeat it, but I guess not a lot of people actually follow that advice. And then Puerto Rico. As of now, as I'm taping this, it's still a disaster. And the question that comes up, I hear this a lot, is we couldn't assist Puerto Rico as well because it's an island. And that's been said from the disaster relief people, the president, all the way and up. I understand the logistics and the complications of that. I will say, though, that I don't think that's an acceptable answer. And please, that's not what you should say if you have to testify in front of Congress or talk to the media. I understand an island makes things much harder to support from a Homeland Security perspective, but that also phrase could come across as callous, especially to people who don't have power or food or clean water. I would also say is, and I mentioned this earlier when I talked about Hurricane Katrina, strategic communications is as much as important as actual disaster relief. In Katrina, again, I don't mean to sound callous, but the government did not at least give the impression that it was saving its citizens, that it was assuring its people that everything was going to be okay. That was a mistake. They let the narrative, particularly the federal government, let the narrative get away with them, and this compounded the disaster and really made Bush never recover politically. Now and again, I'm taping this, there's some sort of Twitter war going on that I didn't get all the full details between the mayor of San Juan and the president of the United States. What I will say that this, from a perception perspective, state and local governments can't do, or the perception will always follow the federal government when you have these disasters. Yes, state and local officials have a massive role, and actually probably the most important role, but they actually don't pay the same political price as the federal government, or at least, let me say it this way. Federal government can't criticize state and local officials. State and local officials can criticize the federal government. And that's just like in the military. You tend not to criticize, at least in public, the platoon leaders and NCOs and the people on the ground actually doing the job. It's the generals and at that level that get the criticism. And that's true at the federal level. And Katrina, again, the state and local officials didn't do a very good job, but because they were close to the disaster, the federal agencies and the federal government got a lot of the blame. Fair or not, I'll let you decide, but that's kind of a perception, even a political perception out there as it relates to emergency relief. And I just want to conclude, you don't want to politicize emergency relief, but just like everything else, there's a political aspect to these things, and I think we're not doing so well in this Puerto Rico issue. Maybe it'll be better by the time you listen to this, but I think I would give us a D- for both the emergency relief and the strategic communications part of it. So, getting back to our curriculum, week 4 review, Iraq WMD. So good comments on the voice thread about Iraq WMD. I just want to make it clear, I kind of separate the Iraq WMD issue into two kind of, maybe not distinct issues, but two separate issues. The politicization that's brought up in the Rachel Maddow documentary that talks about the pressures on the intelligence community from the political side, the bad decisions on the political side. So that's one aspect. But even if you take that point set aside, there were some serious issues with the intelligence community, basic errors that the intelligence community made that would have happened regardless of, I think would have happened regardless of the political aspects of this. So I want you to kind of look at that. And again, there was problems in collection. Really, the curveball highlighted this, and I bring it up in my lectures as well. But that was a massive failure in just basic intelligence practice. The Al-Libi information that was allowed to enter the mainstream regarding chemical weapons training in Iraq, that was another just basic collection failure. Again, analytical failures, a lot of you brought this up, failures in groupthink, just plain incompetence, especially when it came to those infamous aluminum tubes. Negative evidence, which is what I talk about, that the intelligence community didn't focus on, they looked for targets, but they didn't ask the question, is there WMD, what else should we be seeing? Again, these are all analytical flaws that came up. And then I can't remember who brought up the example again of mirror imaging. The intelligence community looked at this as if Iraq was all focused against the United States, when in fact Iraq's deception programs are focused against its neighbors. So again, plenty of analytical failures to choose from. Organizational failures, that's up to you. A lot of people have said that the information was well known at the levels below, at the mid-level analyst level. However, because there was, at the top, all information flowed through George Tenet, the CIA director, whatever George Tenet said was going to be the answer. That's an organizational failure. If the president or the political leaders only get information from one person, and it's filtered through that one person and filtered through his or her biases, then that is a failure in organization. And that can be definitely brought up in the WMD issue, the Iraq WMD issue. And then policy interface. This is, again, euphemism for politicization. I would agree. Well, maybe not completely agree, but if a lot of you said that politicization was the cascading issue throughout this, that if there was no pressure from the top about going to war with Iraq, those failures in collection, those failures in analysis would not have happened. I'll let you decide if that. A lot of times how the intelligence cycle works is there's failures in collection, and that leads to cascading effects down the line. Here it's the failures, arguably, failures in politicization that cause these cascading effects in analytical failures and collection failures down the line. So plenty of places to choose from where these failures happen, and I hope you took away from that. And then 9/11. I want to start off with some questions. Was 9/11 an intelligence failure? I brought this up in the lecture, and if before I saw the Nova NSA documentary, I probably would have said no. 19 shadowy people coming into the country. It's not a conventional threat. It's definitely, you could say, it was not an intelligence failure. However, again, by the NSA documentary that you saw, there were 2 known Al-Qaeda operatives in the United States communicating with a known safe house in Yemen. The NSA knew about it, was tracking this information, but was not passed to other authorities. That is a massive intelligence failure, even in those pre-9/11 days where we might not have been looking out as circumspect as we are now. But that, I think, is a pretty big issue with 9/11, and again, I think it's unacceptable. We knew there was 2 Al-Qaeda operatives in the United States, but again, the information was not spread out through the government. In addition, arguably, we should have known, the intelligence community, the FAA, that an airplane could have been used as a Tomahawk missile, like they were used on 9/11. As you saw in the documentaries, the GIA tried to do that in the Eiffel Tower. Ramzi Yousef had developed a plan to try and do it against various targets in the United States. So using an aircraft in this manner was not completely unheard of. You saw Condoleezza Rice say, we could not have imagined that. Well, no, we could have imagined it. It did happen. There was definitely attempts to do this exact tactic. Moreover, to stop this tactic wouldn't have been a huge muscle movement. If you put reinforced cockpit doors on, you don't have to do it on every airplane, just do it on 20%. Can't have a 9/11-like scenario happen. You put 20% air marshals on aircraft, relatively cheap in retrospect. Can't have a 9/11 incident happen. I mean, hell, if you go on an airplane now, they put a drink cart in front of the cockpit when the cockpit's open. If they did that on 20%, 30% of flights prior to 9/11, there would have been no 9/11-like attack. If you gave just instructions to the crew, the air crew and the flight crew, that make sure that the cockpit isn't taken, use whatever measures you need to make sure that the cockpit is secure, whether it's put a drink cart or just make sure that there's crew awareness, you can't execute a 9/11-like attack. So, again, it's not like we needed to make $100 billion changes. The changes were relatively easy to prevent a 9/11-like attack. So that's why I include 9/11 as an intelligence failure. But I'll let you decide on that. And again, the problems in organization and the failures in imagination are what I bring up in this question here. Another question: What do you do when Bin Laden determined to attack in the U.S.? So let's say you're the intel briefer to George Bush prior to 9/11, and everyone's seen that famous memo when it's brought up to the National Geographic. Bin Laden determined to attack in the United States. And what happens if George Bush tells you, okay, what do you want me to do? What do you want to do? And this is a classic issue of interface with policymakers for the intelligence community. Because the intelligence you just briefed was so vague and so, so vague that a policymaker can't really do anything. What do you want me to do as a policymaker? Do you want me to invade Afghanistan? Do you want me to ground all flights? Do you want me to prevent anyone from coming into the United States? You know, those are massive disruptions in everyone's daily lives right there. So, you know, we talked about week 2 or week 3 about intelligence should stay in its lane and shouldn't get into the policy world. And that's what 90% of intelligence analysts are taught. However, you want to make your intelligence policy relevant. You know, if you're the force protection officer at a major army base and there's a neo-Nazi threat, and your commander says, okay, based on the intelligence you gave me, I'm going to totally shut down operations on my base, which means no, deployments, no vacations, leaves, passes. Is that an appropriate response to the intelligence you gave him? Would it be better to say, sir, there's a neo-Nazi threat, and I would recommend going to level 2 security, or adding more security details at the base? If you said something like that, now you've bracketed the problem so he or she knows, okay, there's a neo-Nazi threat. It's not really serious, but I can implement some countermeasures to reduce the risk. And that's really what you want to do. So if you're going back to this scenario, what do you do? Bin Laden determined to attack in the U.S. And you said something like, and sir, ma'am, or sir in this case, based on this, I would recommend FAA steps up security at 10 of its major airports. Something like that. That lets the president know this is the problem and this is how I could reduce the risk. So intelligence has to get into a little bit into the policy realm in order to be relevant. And this, I think, is a classic case. So organizational issues. The proverbial didn't connect the dots. The NSA documentary goes into this in detail. And I just mentioned how, again, there was information in the intelligence community of bad people coming into the United States, and it wasn't shared across the federal government, and certainly wasn't shared down to state and local level. So failure in organization. And then one thing I ask is, when you see the documentary, or the National Geographic documentary, or for those of you who did saw, where along the chain, and I mentioned this in the lecture, could this have been stopped? And again, the 9/11 hijackers did everything from coming into the country to renting apartments, to getting hotel rooms, getting credit cards, wiring money in and back, getting through airport security, and getting to the cockpit. Now, what countermeasures can be implemented along this chain where if they can't do one of these things, they can't execute a 9/11-like attack? And that's, again, a key point to think about. Again, you always just think about red teaming certain scenarios, and this is certainly one where you can organize the federal government and organize state and local officials to stop an attack like this from even happening. Because you have to get, if you're a terrorist, you got to get 10 things right in order to execute this. And from the federal government, if you could interrupt that chain, no 9/11-like scenario. So paper 2, I want to just briefly touch on this. So it's a strategic paper. It says case studies. So choose one of the case studies we talk about and go in depth. I will allow you, based on some of the feedback I got, if you don't want to focus on just one case study, if you want to focus on an intelligence issue and show how it weaves through multiple case studies, I will allow you to do that. And what I mean by that is, if you want to focus on failures in collection and show how failures in collection caused intelligence failures in Pearl Harbor, in Iraq WMD, in Yom Kippur War, I will allow you to do that. The one thing I ask is you don't give me a laundry list of, okay, here's 20 intelligence failures that have been the most important issues coming down the line. I just want you to focus on just 2 or 3 and just show me how they've cascaded and caused failures down the line. So I give you the option. You can either do one case and focus on that, or you can do multiple cases and just focus on one of the failures in collection, failures in analysis, politicization, all the things we've talked about in this class, and all the problems with the intelligence cycle. So I want to make that clear from the onset. And again, just some of the failures in collection. You don't have to choose these. I just want it to go and to kind of review here. There was Pearl Harbor, the failure to understand where the Japanese carriers were. That's a pretty big failure in collection. Yom Kippur War, the over-reliance on single human sources. The Iraq War, again, the over-reliance on curveball, the over-reliance on intelligence from al-Libi. These are all failures in collection that arguably, and I want you to argue in your paper, caused cascading intelligence failures down the line. There were failures in analysis, and I should say Pearl Harbor. We talked about plenty of failures in analysis. Basically couldn't fathom that a 9/11-like attack or a Pearl Harbor attack could happen. That was a huge failure in analysis. And the confessions, confirmation bias was a failure in analysis, and that's the documentary where those 4 guys were falsely arrested for the rape and murder of that case. Iraq WMD, groupthink, negative evidence, proximity bias, mirror imaging. All those are failures in analysis after collection occurred and an analysis was the cause of the failure. Politicization or policy interface, Iraq WMD, we talked about that in depth. The confessions, arguably the confessions is a case of politicization where DNA evidence and alibi evidence was not wanted to be heard because the detectives and the prosecutors and the judges had who they wanted to, they had who they wanted to arrest. That is kind of politicization. Evidence was, if not manipulated, at least ignored. Contrary evidence was ignored. And then the 9/11, I just talked about the policy interface a second ago between how intelligence is communicated to policymakers, whether it was so vague that or wasn't enough where a policymaker could have reduced risk. So these are, and then finally issues of organization. The 9/11, the NSA documentary goes into detail. I just talked about problems in intelligence organization. Pearl Harbor, the information was at the federal level that could have obviated the Pearl Harbor intelligence failure. The fusion centers, which you saw that documentary on, and it's a 9/11, post 9/11 reform. Information is supposed to be pushed down to the lowest level, and you saw in that documentary or in that video that the Azia Jarrah, one of the 9/11 hijackers, was on a watch list, but he was on a federal watch list, and that information wasn't pushed down to state and local officials. And I will let you, because in week 5, we're going to talk about things like the Boston Marathon attack, Fort Hood shooting, other intelligence failures related to counterterrorism. I will let you use some of the information from those case studies if you want to talk about in this paper. So, don't just use those case studies, because the focus is on the case, the week 3 and week 4 case studies, Pearl Harbor, Yom Kippur War, Iraq WMD, and 9/11. But, we're going to talk about some more case studies, and I'll let you weave those into this paper if you want to. So, that covers paper 2. Speaking of week 5, so it's counterterrorism week. Case studies: Fort Hood, underwear bomber, Boston, and then EU ISIS are the 4 case studies you're going to go into detail this week. The readings, again, the Fort Hood shooting. Again, fortunately, we got to say the first Fort Hood shooting. The Boston Marathon bombing. Those are your 2 readings, the congressional report on those. And again, figure out where the failures occurred on for these case studies. The documentaries, the Christmas Day bomber, December 25th, 2009, the BBC documentary, excellent. And then the EU terrorism documentary, PBS Frontline, excellent documentary. And the question is, why do we still have these failures, despite billions, trillions, depending how you count it, spent on the intelligence community? Why do we still have intelligence failures to the present day? And hopefully this will give you a framework of how to look at current incidents that are happening, whether it's Orlando, whether it's what's going on in London or going on in Paris. Hopefully this will give you a framework to understand those in a little bit more detail. So as always, if there's questions or issues, please let me know, and I look forward to your discussion board questions.